Oh, is it on? Yeah. You hear it? Thank you, Bhante. For today's talk, I would like to read a segment from the Majjhima Nikaya and a segment from the Anguttara Nikaya, segments of from the Tripitaka that the Buddha has. The first one actually, he talked to his own son, Rahula, as far as the choices we make in what will end up being our actions, and also nobility, which is the portion on the Anguttara Nikaya, which I will be briefly going over. So the first one has to do with virtuous behavior. What do you think, Rahula? What is the purpose of a mirror? For the purpose of reflection, Bhante. So too, Rahula, an action with the body should be done after repeated reflection. An action by speech should be done after repeated reflection. An action by mind should be done after repeated reflection. Notice that the word action is being used for all these, whether it's speech, thought, or bodily action. That's one huge difference between Buddhism and other traditions, because it places such a big emphasis even on a thought, hence the intention behind them, which will be relevant later on in the talk. Rahula, when you wish to do an action with the body, you should reflect upon that same bodily action thus. Would this action that I wish to do with the body lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both? Is it an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results? When you reflect, if you know, this action that I wish to do with the body would lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, it is an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results. Then you definitely should not do such an action with the body. But when you reflect, if you know, this action that I wish to do with the body would not lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, it is a wholesome bodily action with pleasant consequences, with pleasant results, then you may do such an action with the body. Also, Rahula, while you are doing an action with the body, you should reflect upon that same bodily action thus. Does this action that I am doing with the body lead to my own affliction that I am doing in the body? So now, instead of it being something that is trajected towards the future, would this action per se become one that is going to result in affliction for me or for some other people? Now you're bringing it into the present tense. So you're going through these checks and balances before the actual committing of the action. So even within the process of doing that particular action, the Buddha is inculcating, is trying to inspire his own son to question, even while he's in the midst of doing it. Is it an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results? And conversely, he also goes into the past, in this case. Also, Rahula, after you have done an action with the body, you should reflect upon that same bodily action thus. Did this action that I did with the body lead to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both? Oftentimes when we do something, say something, or think something, we just think of it as, well, done deal, it's gone. What's the point in pondering over the possibilities or even consequences of it? However, that is extremely important for us to take a moment and pause to reflect upon what might be a consequence or a resultant factor of the thing that we might have said or done or even thought. Was it an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results? When you reflect, if you know, this action that I did with the body led to my own affliction, or to the affliction of others, or to the affliction of both, it was an unwholesome bodily action with painful consequences, with painful results, then you should confess such a bodily action, reveal it, and lay it upon to the teacher or to your wise companions in the holy life. Having confessed it, revealed it, and laid it open, you should undertake restraint for the future. But when you reflect, if you know, this action that I did with the body did not lead to my own affliction or to the affliction of others, or to both, it is a wholesome bodily action with pleasant consequences, pleasant results, you can abide happy and glad, training day and night in wholesome states. Happiness is not a passive state. Happiness is the choice of the courageous ones. Happiness is a heroic characteristic, true happiness, because it changes one's life and those of others. In the Dhammapada, we find the Buddha, I've mentioned this several times because it's so inspiring. You look and you see how the Buddha describes his community of not just monks and nuns, but laity as well. He calls all of his congregation, we are the happy ones. It's so simple, not often easy, to be deliberate in the choosing of our thoughts, in the choosing of our words, in the choosing of our actions. Which brings me to the second brief segment that I will read, and it has to do with an excerpt from the Anguttara Nikaya. What, monks, is accomplishment in virtuous behavior? Here a noble disciple abstains from the destruction of life, abstains from taking what is not given, abstains from sexual misconduct, abstains from false speech, abstains from liquor, wine, and intoxicants, the basis for heedlessness. This is called accomplishment in virtuous behavior. So basically, the 5 precepts he's referring to. The reason why I chose these 2 was because of yesterday's events. Buddhism is a very humanistic path. It has everything to do with the world we live in, the world that we make for ourselves to live in, and the world that we hopefully prepare for posterity, for others, other beings to live in the future. As I was thinking about today's talk, I chose the word that the Buddha used to describe, to delineate many of the core concepts and principles of his Dharma, of his teaching. Namely, the word noble, nobility. What is that? During the 45 years of his teaching, many times the Buddha is approached by the noble so-called classes of India, be they the Kshatriyas or the ruling classes, the warriors, or the Brahmins, who were on the top, highest echelon of Indian life, or caste systems, I would say. And many people who approached the Buddha asking him about nobility, noble birth, meaning a Brahmin usually denotes nobility. The Buddha would just wait for them to finish, and he would ask them a series of questions. Typically, for example, even to this day in India, if someone is to be called a Brahmin, they need to be Brahmin by 7 generations if you go back on both sides, paternally and maternally. That means for 7 generations, their parents or grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents, they needed to have been both Brahmin so that they can maintain the purity or nobility of their blood. Technically, that's how it was at the time of the Buddha when they approached, and by the same token, it's still carried on to this day in India, that aspect of Brahmanism. However, we don't necessarily have to put this within the framework of just an Indian culture or the contemporary issues of the Buddha, because we see it today in all cultures in the world. You go to any society around the world where you might be surrounded by a particular majority, that would be termed as the nobility of that setting. Their narrative would be, we are at the highest echelon of society. We are the point. We are the standard. And there's a certain adherence or attachment that comes along with that. I've lived in different parts of the world, and I've seen this in different parts of the world. This, what we might call racism, sexism, any ism, particularly when it comes to our modern day, the United States, we are dealing with this problem at a very hurtful and as far as afflictions go, what we read, in a very nasty way as far as consequences that it's leaving behind, in diluting and in negatively affecting society, where neighbors are turning against neighbors, co-workers are turning against co-workers, fellow Americans are doing the same thing, where they're just trying to put a mask on the ill will that's within them by any justifying means possible. And the higher the authority that's kind of instigating it, the better it is, the more validating that is becoming for the person to justify their anger and really do some crazy, stupid things without considering, is what I'm about to do going to cause affliction to me or to my fellow human being or other beings? Is what I am doing, that gentleman who actually drove his car into the anti-protesters yesterday in Virginia, killing this 32-year-old woman, was he thinking that? Or might he have paused when he was being arrested after the fact, after all that debacle took place? Could he have paused while as he was being handcuffed and put into the police car, taken away? Was the thing that I just did conducive to anything wholesome? Could any good thing come out of that? These are questions that unfortunately oftentimes we don't ask. Instead, we just jump on our emotional reactions to whatever is being done. Whether it's that person who's committing that violent, inhumane act, or us standing on the outskirts of that scenario and just looking and completely judging the situation. And for many of us, rightfully so. I mean, what is the standard of our society, as our civilization? You see, without asking questions like these, I really have a difficulty looking at the world and just calling it civilized. Or even my own life, because that's who I have a control over, my own personal life and the choices I make in my thoughts, in my words, and my actions. And that's what the Buddha is bringing us towards, again and again and again. And one of the best ways that he formulated in helping us to navigate these difficult waters is by giving us the 5 precepts. Sometimes people think, because many of us come from a Judeo-Christian background, we might start thinking, oh, they're like the commandments. They're not. No one's going to be shooting down bolts of lightning when we break one of these precepts, for one. Second, no one gives it to us. The precepts are asked for by ourselves. We request it, in fact, a few times before the preceptor hands it to us. And when we do break them, because they are training rules, by the way. They are training rules. That means I undertake the training rule to keep the precept of, for example, not to kill or harm beings on purpose. I undertake the training, meaning I am exerting myself, I'm exercising those muscles. And if so happens that I break that precept, no one's going to come and, hit me over the head. But I have to deal with that myself. So at that point, one of the best ways is to find a statue of Buddha, or even if you don't have one, if you can just imagine in your mind and just retake the precept again right there on the spot, instead of skulking in that negative, remorseful feeling and just being like, I can't believe I broke the precept. I shouldn't have. Which is even worse. It's detrimental to our progress. So what then it allows us to do is to develop the capacity to have and maintain loving kindness towards ourselves, because that's where it all starts. Metta, or loving kindness, needs the soil, the nutrients of forgiveness for ourselves and for those around us. Without the nutritious soil, the atmosphere, and all the wonderful things that are necessary for this sprouting little plant to turn into this mighty tree that bears fruit, it requires love for oneself. It requires kindness towards ourselves. You see, no one who is pondering or is about to do anything harmful, no such person can do so if they have within them even a tiny little speck of forgiveness, even a tiny little speck of compassion towards themselves. That's how powerful it is. I was mentioning it to a friend of mine the other day, and I said, you cannot be laughing wholeheartedly. You cannot be so happy, but at the same time be angry at someone else. Something has to cut. The bond has to get lopped off somewhere. Now, what I'm describing is the art of living. The art of living is one that involves responsibility. And if you recall from the first reading, where the Buddha is talking to his son Rahula, describing to him the importance of asking some key questions. Is what I'm about to do, say, or think, really conducive for me to be happy, glad, calm, not lose sleep over, etc., etc.? Basically, when I'm driving home after I've committed this act, am I going to feel amazingly good? Instead of the mind coming in and trying to cover something up, create a new narrative so that I can actually justify the act. See, in Buddhism, there's no need for any justification. I've never come across it. In all these years of studying it, I've never come across any aspect of the teachings where there is a justifying factor. In a sense, like the Buddha saying, oh, it's because of da-da-da-da-da. The same way. There's a sense of overwhelming, embracing sense of equanimity, calmness and gladness. When you're practicing the satipatthana, or the four bases of foundations of mindfulness training, the Buddha constantly goes back to the importance of gladdening the mind, opening the mind, gladdening the mind, calming the mind, relaxing the body. I don't know about you, but every time I've had an evil or negative or nasty or unwholesome thought or speech or even an action, during and especially after, my body was just like cringed up a little bit. When I'm about to say something unwholesome, or right after especially, your jaw muscles start acting weird. And there's this tightness in your heart. Remember the reference to a hero earlier? How many times have we seen heroes who walk like this, with closed chests, the heart completely collapsed within itself, onto itself? The typical example of a heroic figure is always the chest is broadly open and available completely. In fact, one of the 32 signs of a superhuman being, or sappurisa, as described in the teachings that the Buddha had, is his chest was always broadly available and open. He had nothing to hide. And that's also a symbol for his teachings as well, the Dhamma. Bhante G. Gunaratna from Bhavana Society, he mentions the beauty, one of the beautiful aspects of the Dharma. He says, the Dharma has no secrets. The Buddha made sure of that. And there's a term for it. The term is, in English it's translated something like, the Dharma shines when it's laid out in the open, just like a diamond. Not when it's hidden. You know, in ancient times, even probably to this day, when teachers in meditation and teachings of the sort, when they had apprentices or students who were really advancing well enough, it doesn't have to be just meditation, it could be any type of a discipline that requires effort and work and studying, they would always keep something in the back pocket, as it were. They would not reveal everything to the students, just in case the student might turn on them or something. There's no such thing in the Dharma. At one point he turned to his students, the Buddha, and said, my hands are open. I'm not holding anything in. I'm not clasping anything. I'm not hiding. There's nothing covert. But we like to distance ourselves by changing, by replacing, and by just postponing our responsibilities. Whether it's changing the narrative into, well, what the Buddha was talking about is actually totally irrelevant today, type of a situation. Well, he couldn't have possibly understood what's going on in the world today because look what's happening. There's so much noise. Well, yeah, that's a perfect nutritious soil for metta to develop, for understanding to develop. Because just like that individual who crashed his car into people, the anger laden within this person's mind, the ignorance that's there, oftentimes we also need to look at ourselves. How much of that do we actually carry within us? And it's instigating something. Because we have a skill of doing, I'm reacting to this situation that happened, which is totally unjust. So this anger that I'm feeling, which is the second poison of the three defilements, which is anger, dosa, ill will, aversion, we start to justify that. That sense of anger and aversion that we're now feeling towards this heinous act, we start justifying the anger within us. The tranquility of the mind is gone now. Now, how can we navigate? How can we maintain a state of mind that facilitates what's happening without having to close our eyes, negating what's happening in front of us, justifying anything, including the anger within us? Here's where I bring you back to that, the mentioning of metta is, or love, or happiness, not being a passive undertaking. It's very active. It's not easy to forgive. It's not easy to love. It's not easy to pause and say, wait a minute, what is really going on here first, not outside? In one of the previous talks I gave, the mention was on, it's always easy for us to point the finger and say, point out the ignorance in the outside world. It's the easiest thing. Oh, the boss is always, he's messed up. He just does not have any understanding. He's this or she's this or whatever. The traffic in LA is horrible. How come there needs to be so many people? Da 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 da. But what is the real conversation that's going on between the ears? That's where this reading comes in. And that's where we start getting glimpses of nobility. See, for 45 years, the Buddha would always point out to these individuals who would come and talk to him about, well, what is nobility? I'm noble, this and that. They would sit down and they would demand that they be respected according to their caste system. Okay. The Buddha would just ask them questions on that, in reference to the intention behind the act, and which makes a person truly noble. It is the action that makes a person noble. That would be the underlying theme of the Buddha's responses. So there's, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of royalty figures out there in the world today. Princes, dukes, duchesses, kings, queens, etc. I just laugh at that. I've always found it fascinatingly absurd. But it's some remnant from our past. And I would just think, okay, with all this hoopla that's going on with these individuals, multi-million-dollar weddings, things like that, and wow, their nobility, I should pay attention to them. I'm like, why? Why does a person whose skin color is lighter, or who has a certain ethnic background, be more important than someone who does not fit that bill? Be different or treated differently? One time I read a story about Ambedkar. Ambedkar, he was a person who really changed the caste system, in a sense, in India. And he belonged to the untouchable caste. and which means that they don't have any of the rights. Education is, of course, out the window. There's no way. Being treated like an equal or a human, it's impossible. So, so there was somewhat of a silent revolution in India, where many of the untouchables became Buddhists, and some became Muslim, and others, they just stayed. However, the ones who turned Buddhists, who are practicing, and today, I'm glad to say there's a good, vibrant Buddhist communities in India, thanks to them. Because for a long time in India, Buddhism was completely gone, eradicated. So they brought it back. So there's one story that he told. I read it through an article years ago, where he's Indira Gandhi, I think she was the first prime minister, a female prime minister in the world, and she was the prime minister of India. At the time, I think India had about 750 million people, the biggest democratic nation in the world. Pretty impressive. She's about to board a plane, presidential plane, and as is customary, the pilots had to greet her at the steps of the stairs that take you up to the plane. And every pilot needs to introduce themselves. She is the head of state, after all. And as one pilot introduces himself, and she shakes his hand, and then the other one introduces his name and reaches out so that she could shake his. From the name, she immediately realizes that this person's last name matches those of a lower class person. And guess what? He was. Against so many odds, this person had left the slums of India, somehow was able to get an education, somehow was able to go to the UK, somehow was able to get an education as a pilot, and not just any pilot, because you're now flying a jet airline. And he was there proudly standing as a human being who accomplished so much, and was thrilled to be shaking the hand of the Prime Minister, who was now refusing to shake his. And she refused to get on the plane because he was not of her caste. I was stunned. I had so much respect for her up until that moment. I mean, she made so many changes happen in the world, especially, in India, I presume. However, that incident definitely puts a smudge, doesn't it, on the whole thing. Now, some of, I was mentioning earlier, these microaggressions that we carry within ourselves, instead of them bursting and boiling up into something really horrific, they can also turn into these opportunities for us to look back at ourselves and see whether what I'm thinking of is truly wholesome, whether I'm about to say is truly wholesome, whether what I'm about to do is truly wholesome for me, because if it is wholesome for me, it is going to be wholesome for you. And that's what the wholesomeness means. Kusala is a powerful word in Buddhism. That means it will not have any negative effects, consequences later on, even during in some cases. It will promote a state of happiness and gladness. Now, maintaining this type of an objective in one's thoughts, words, and actions is the epitome of being noble, not one's blue blood, not one's nobility, not what your last name says or how many acronyms it has, the third, second, whatever. So, how are we time, Bhante?
Almost.
Okay, so we have time for questions?
Yes.
All right. Any questions? Thank you for listening thus far. Yes.
You said forgiveness is very easy, but
Not easy. Sorry. Yeah.
But to forget it is very hard. I can forgive right away, and then I will forget it for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it comes back again and again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's gonna bother me.
Of course.
How can I can let it go? Just happen.
I have good news and bad news. If I would call, I was just joking about the bad news part. But in Buddhism, there's always good news. That's the good part about it. We cannot let go of anything. And that was pointed out to me by one of my meditation teachers, which was stunning to me, just like the stunned look on your face right now. Because it requires understanding. You know, the dead leaves on a tree when the seasons change fall on their own. No one comes and plucks them one at a time. When we stop the supply of nutrients, in this case, the constant remembering of, I remember what you did to me that time. You remember you did this to me. You said this, you embarrassed me in front of... What am I doing? Even though I might have convincingly forgiven this person, even wrote it in my journals probably, but deep down, when push came to shove, I always reminded myself of those tiny little snippets of memories. You did that to me. That means that we are supplying still nutrients into that leaf. It's not going to fall. However, when we start understanding that in fact when I'm forgiving someone, it's not just for them, I'm actually releasing myself. It's for me, above all else. It's not about the world, it never is, it's all about this person. When I'm forgiving you, am I feeling a little bit better? You can start by that question. And that has to do, everything to do with wholesomeness, because the happy or gladdened state is wholesome, it's kusala. So it's not the act of forgiving, because yes, you cannot forgive. Some people have hurt us so badly in life, and that's totally understandable. We need to appreciate and give it some weight, yes, but not enough for it to bog us down, to pull us down and bind us down from really blossoming and turning into the better version of ourselves. Because I'm sorry, I'm not going to be a victim of you and what you chose to do or say and do to me. My happiness does not depend on your choices. See, that completely shifts the attention now. It's not like, you hurt me, I'm a victim, so my teacher or whatever is saying I should forgive, okay, fine, I'll forgive you. I'll put you out of my mind. Nope. That's not going to work. Because it's just going to be suppressing it, and then it's just like bellows out and just like a bursting volcano. However, when there is insight and understanding, wow, this person doesn't bother me anymore. Now, they might keep on going ahead and doing more of the negative things in their lives. None of my, it's not in my control, right? That's their choices. My choice is to relieve myself of the excess baggage. So, but it takes practice. That's why it's not easy. And by the same token, I don't believe anyone who just immediately says, I forgave him, and that's it. If that works for them, that's fine, but in those hot peak moments when memories kick in, it's really difficult. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. How can we ensure that our endeavors to develop metta for ourselves don't result in our being self-centered? It's always about forgiving ourselves, loving ourselves, everything about ourselves. The world may do whatever it does, but it always comes back to what we think about it, how we respond to it, and it just seems like almost like so self-centered. Like it's all about me and how I feel about myself, what I do with myself.
I see what you're saying.
And I mean, maybe a little facetious, but just trying to make the point.
No, I understand.
I'm sure that my practice doesn't turn into I don't care what happens to my family. Like
yes.
Fine,
Yes. Well, thank you for pointing that out. That's not the intention of my words. Sometimes all it takes is a simple, blatant statement for the mind to just stop at its tracks. In those moments, you can say, it's not about the outside world, it's about me. Immediately it puts the attention, the microscope, whatever, on yourself. And then you start working on this person. As far as that is concerned, that's where it stops. That's that metaphor, the analogy, or the symbolism. However, we do not exist in a vacuum. The reason who we are and what we are and how we do what we do today is because of many, many factors. Not just from birth, not from our 23 from dad, 23 chromosome from mom situation. No, it goes far back in time, according to this teaching. However, you don't even have to believe in rebirth necessarily to look at this psychophysical dynamic phenomenon and just say it's just here. Because the way that child just sneezed has an impact. There's some years ago, scientists were saying the way that a butterfly flutters its wings in the Amazon has an impact in the way agriculture works in Canada. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but something to that effect. That means the interdependence of everything. And Buddhism is the epitome of this, as far as the disciplines go about interdependence. So please look at what I described in that context. Because, of course, the individual who crashed into people yesterday obviously was brought into discussion today. So it had an impact on many of us. It was his choice. But it allows me to look at my own defilements as well. Now that doesn't mean that I'm not aware of what's going on and I'm not wanting to change the world.
So that's just the first step then.
Yes.
Looking at myself first is the first step.
Yes.
The next step would be moving out.
Of course, you cannot influence the world outside of you without first starting from here. Otherwise, it's just fictitious. It's just facade, superficial, just like that icing type of a forgiveness. Because whatever benefits I gain here, whatever fruits, inevitably, invariably, they will flow out into the world around me because there's a personality change that occurs. Yes?
I was just going to add.
Yes, please.
Through that when you start with yourself, even in the manna, it's the first step.
Mm-hmm.
I always see Buddhism as very active religion. Very active. It's your first step, and then your actions go out. And we have examples in the 20th century of people who are not necessarily Buddhists, like to look to for something like yesterday. There's Martin Luther King, who changed the world through nonviolence. There's Gandhi. There's in our own Buddhist tradition, Thich Nhat Hanh. I mean, these are people that start here, and then the ripple effect. And if you look at the metta prayer, it starts, or chant, it starts with "May I be," and then it reaches out. It keeps reaching out even to the end. So there's a very, to me, my Buddhism, or Buddhism to me is a very active religion. And when you all go back to Buddha, his actions changed the world. I mean, it wasn't all, I'm going to be, but it starts here. It has to start here. Or you're going to do that, but
Mhm.
that's
Thank you. I'll be here again. I mean, after the ceremony, so you can ask.
You can have more questions. Chandana is here.
Thank you for listening.